Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Geri Spieler, an investigative journalist and author of the new book, Regina of Warsaw, Love, Loss, and Liberation. The immigrant experience is a cornerstone of American history, yet it is often fraught with challenges and hardships. According to the Pew Research Center, the U.S. is home to 1/5 of the world's international migrants, with the foreign-born population reaching a record 46.1 million in 2022. Immigrants today face numerous struggles, including navigating complex legal systems that keep getting complex, overcoming language barriers, and dealing with discrimination and xenophobia that is on the rise with the rise of ultranationalism in the West. A 2023 survey by the Kaiser Family Foundation found that immigrants often face significant challenges in accessing healthcare, education, and employment opportunities, elements that are crucial for successful life. You're listening to The Andrew Jose Show, your go-to podcast on all things culture, society, and entertainment. Geri Spieler's book, Regina of Warsaw, offers a poignant reminder of the sacrifices and resilience of immigrants. The book traces the courageous journey of Spieler's grandmother, Regina Anuszewicz, who escaped violent anti-Semitism in Poland with her infant before World War I and found her way to the United States of America. From the first page of Spieler's book, readers are transported to 1906 Bialystok, Poland, where Regina's life was forever changed by a violent anti-Semitic pogrom. This traumatic event ignited Regina's passion to fight anti-Semitism and shaped every decision she made as she moved from Poland to the United States, caring for her 4 children along the way. Spieler's work sheds light on the ongoing struggles faced by immigrants and serves as a powerful reminder of the bravery and perseverance required to seek a better life. Without further ado, let's head straight to my interview with Geri Spieler. Geri Spieler is an investigative journalist and award-winning speaker who has written articles for the Los Angeles Times, Forbes, Huffington Post, Westways, and was a featured correspondent for the San Francisco Chronicle. She founded and edited Electronic Commerce News, a technology journal published by Phillips Business Information, which led to her getting a 6-year assignment as a research director and analyst for Gartner Group. She is a United States History Award winner from the International Book Awards, won the Best Nonfiction True Crime Award from BookFest, and received 5 stars from Reader's Favorite for her work, among other accolades. She lives in Northern California with her husband, her pet chickens, and her fruit trees. Geri Spieler, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Could you give us a brief background, Geri, of the historical and social context Regina, your grandmother, who you write about in your book, was born into, and the context she had immigrated to in the United States? So could you give the historical and social background both in Poland, where she was born, and the United States, where she immigrated to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. My grandmother was Regina Anuszewicz. She was one of 6. She was born in Warsaw, Poland. And in 1906, there was a pogrom, which is a Russian word for a violent raid, in Bialystok that she witnessed with her sister. And that anti-Semitic raid really raised her level of anti-Semitism very high. And at the turn of the century, there was a lot going on in Eastern Europe, not just anti-Semitism, but a lot of violence in general. Regina, my grandmother, was a translator, and she got married. She had a little baby boy. And as the violence increased, she became much more sensitive to it and wanted to leave, saying, it's not good here for us. We need to leave. It's going to be bad. But her family said, no, it's going to be fine. You're overreacting. But it decreased. And she finally said, I cannot raise my child in this environment. And so she left her husband. She took her little boy in 1910. She didn't speak English, but she traveled alone thousands of miles away to escape the violence that was growing in Eastern Europe. Got married again. She had 3 other children. This story, Regina of Warsaw, Love, Loss, and Liberation, which is the title of this book, is based on her life and her events. She ended up in Chicago. She had 3 more children. Grandpa disappeared and left my grandmother with 4 little children, my mother, the youngest, being 2 years old. And she said, well, if I have to be poor, I don't also need to be cold. So she got herself to Los Angeles. My mother and her sisters were raised in a Jewish orphanage in Los Angeles called Vista Del Mar. It still exists. It's no longer an orphanage. It's a home for kids at risk. So that's the basis of this book, is this woman's story. Had she not left, you and I would not be having this conversation. And of course, I grew up knowing her story. And so why did I write about it now? I've written other books. I've certainly done a lot of other writing. But something that's going on in society in the United States today, indeed in the world, made me feel like I needed to tell her story.
How did you ensure the historical accuracy of the events depicted in Regina of Warsaw? What challenges would you say you faced in reconstructing your grandmother's story? And how did the whole process come about? And what level of artistic liberty did you take in writing the book?
Sure. The genre is historical fiction, which means that the history is all accurate. The fiction, I call it the glue that put the conversations that, put these pieces together. Knowing my grandmother, where she grew up, and moving to the country, of course, was easily laid out for me. The pieces were the conversations and some of the events that pushed her here. Of course, I had to do a lot of research about the history of Poland at the time. I have a fun story to tell about that. A lot of times when I'm doing certain kinds of research, I'll reach out to university professors because many of them have a very narrow piece of history that they've written about. And I found 3 professors in this country that focused on Poland at the turn of the century, and one individual, Professor Robert Blaubaum of West Virginia University wrote about women in Poland at the turn of the century. So how much more perfect could that get? Professor Blaubaum was just wonderful. He was so generous in explaining and describing women and in Poland at the turn of the century. And who knew there was a small feminist movement at that time? Women were starting to work outside of the home. Who knew? So helping fill in my grandmother's time in Poland as a graduate from high school, knowing Russian, knowing Yiddish, knowing Polish, helped me create what she learned about in seeing the events that came across. She was working at the Jewish Labor Bund. The Labor Bund is a socialist organization that's all over the country. And she was one in Warsaw. And so she saw news from all over Eastern Europe. And she was privileged to events that were happening. And as she tried to, share this with her family, they didn't want to hear it. They said she was overreacting. She was an alarmist. This is, you need to stop paying attention to these things. They don't matter. And of course, she's saying, yes, they do. This is real. So I built that case, building her case for actually leaving her husband and her whole family, everything she knew in her whole life, and getting on a train that ended up in Scotland, where she took the SS California from Scotland to New York and then to Chicago. So those conversations, of course, are fiction. I knew about my Uncle Louis, her boy's father. He was born in Poland. I knew my mother and her sisters were born in Chicago. And I knew that my grandfather disappeared. Whenever I'd ask Grandma about Grandpa, she would just shrug her shoulders and change the subject. So we don't know what happened to him. He just didn't exist anymore. And she wouldn't talk about it. So the conversations were the fiction connecting the events of her life and what I knew about her.
So more like narrative nonfiction with dramatizations to advance a plot. Okay.
Yes.
So are you in touch with the section of the family that Regina left behind when she made the move from Poland to the United States? During the course of writing the book, did you have a chance to speak to the other side of the family back in Poland? How was their experience as things got worse in Europe after Regina left, with the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of Hitler?
I did. Of course, this all took place 30 years before World War II, which is an interesting time. I actually found relatives I didn't know existed. I found two of my mother's cousins. They were the sons of one of her brother. And so one of them has already died, but I met him in Warsaw, and they filled in a lot of information I never knew that my grandmother wouldn't talk about. But these were my mother's first cousins, and they were survivors of the Holocaust. They were the only two survivors, except for the children, one of her sisters, who actually went to Paris and hid from the Nazis in Paris. But Joseph Anuszewicz and Janusz Anuszewicz survived. Joseph became a colonel in the Russian army. There were a lot of boys that went to the Russian army, the Red Army, during the war. And Janusz, his younger brother, who was 12 at the time, went up into the Ural Mountains and worked in a mine. And they actually survived. Two of my grandmother's siblings died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and two others died in the Warsaw Ghetto. But my grandmother Regina survived, and her sister Chacha Fega, who went to Paris. She married a rabbi and she knew he was going to be assigned outside of Poland, and that's what she wanted to do. She wanted to get out of Poland herself, and that was her way. Of course, Paris was invaded by the Nazis, and they were hidden on a farm during the war. So there wasn't any communication for like 4 years, and then they connected again, I found one of Chachafega's daughters, who is like a second cousin to me. So these people really helped inform me on what was going on with her relatives and what happened at the time. So that was another piece of the glue that I could piece together with my grandmother's events.
Were there any members of the family who made Aliyah to Israel?
There was one young man, and there's not a lot of communication, who actually is in Israel, and I think he's probably like a second cousin as well. He was in Jerusalem there, but there isn't a lot of communication going on at that, these days.
Just to understand the historical context, so when the persecution happened, especially in the opening of the book where Regina's sister is attacked by Russian soldiers, that was the Russian Empire. And the persecution that Regina anticipated, was that something that was in the lead up to the Russian Revolution, or the Russian Revolution had happened by then? Just to understand.
That was 1910. I think it was a little before the Russian Revolution, but certainly it was part of the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were allowed to live. The town of Bialystok was building the textile industry because of the Bialy River. And so they were building these textile mills, and they had these boarding houses because they needed people to work in the mills. So they had boarding houses for men and they had boarding houses for women. And Chachafega was working at the Lewandowski mill, which was one of the new mills in Bialystok. And so this particular pogrom was, on the border of Poland, the Russian Empire, and Russia. And so it was kind of new. It was a pogrom that a lot of people didn't even know about because it was very early on. But of course it did exist. And there was, of course, a lot of horror and a lot of slaughter that went on at the time.
Can it be argued that Regina's story mirrors some of the struggles faced by immigrants today? If so, could you elaborate on these parallels and how they resonate with contemporary issues? And a question I have now is, currently there's a lot of immigration controls that came with World War II and the World War, which has made immigration difficult. But during Regina's time, how the immigration process was like? Was it she just takes a ship to Ellis Island and then gets processed there? Or were there some precursors to this bureaucratic, red tape heavy immigration and asylum process that we have today existing at Regina's time?
It was easier then than it was with the World War II, and there was a lot of pushback, immigrants coming to, and we know the United States, was not allowing ships to unload on our shores. There was a lot of, pushback then that a lot of people aren't even aware of what was going on in this country, and anti-Semitism even after World War II in this country. For Grandma, she worked with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, to help her come to this country. So while there were a lot of Eastern Europeans coming in at the turn of the century, it wasn't as difficult as it was right after World War II. But there was, bureaucratic red tape, but it was not quite as difficult. But certainly in the early 40s, and after World War II, there was more anti-Semitism, there was more pushback on these immigrants coming. But when we look at immigrants, what they were fleeing was violence. What immigrants are coming to this country today is violence, looking for a better life. Grandma, was fleeing, the anti-Semitism and the violence that was existing at the turn of the century, just as people are coming here at, trying to find a better life. We're seeing more anti-Semitism now. I think the book is a cautionary tale of, at what point do you have to say, stop, I'm leaving? What does it take for somebody to pick up, walk out the door, leave everything, everyone you've ever known, with the language you don't know, and say, I'm fleeing for my life? That's what people were doing then. And that's certainly what people were doing, during World War II. And the pushback of, don't come to my country, you're taking my job. So I think, there were some difficulties, but it got more and more difficult as the years went on. But for my mother and her sisters, when they were born in Chicago and then Los Angeles, they were living in this wonderful orphanage. When I say orphanage, people think of Dickinson, or Dickens. And it was a wonderful place. It was supporting these kids that were coming in from these refugees who didn't have any money, who didn't have a lot of skills, but they wanted to take care of these children. And so it was more like a boarding house. And they would say to the parents, you're still their parents. Come on the weekends. Take your children home for the weekend. Bring them back Sunday night, but go to school. They had great medical care. They had all the food they needed. My mother used to say, we didn't even know there was a depression. We had everything. We went to the beach. We went to the movies. We didn't know there were any problems. The community of Los Angeles made sure these kids had the best of everything. They took care of these children. And my mom said, we were better off living at Vista Del Mar than we were at home because Mama Laban, had a job at a bakery. She didn't make a lot of money. The only child living with her was my uncle, who was older. So Vista Del Mar was a godsend for all of these little Jewish children whose family came here fleeing the violence of Eastern Europe at the time.
How supportive was the local Jewish community in the United States? Now, I've often heard about tensions that existed at the time between the Ashkenazi Jews in New York and the new arrivals from Eastern Europe. Was there any tensions that she faced with Jewish people who hailed from Western Europe or who were already here? And keeping the matter of tensions aside, what support networks existed among Jewish people at that time, aside from Vista Del Mar?
Yeah. I think there definitely was tension between German Jews, and Polish Jews. They were looked down on. And, that's something that I was aware of when I was doing my research on the different Jewish factions. We didn't see a lot of Sephardic Jews coming to the country at that time. It was really a fire hose of Eastern Europe, fleeing what was going on in the Pale of Settlement and the pogroms that were growing and growing. And then, of course, we had Kristallnacht. Grandma pretty much kept to herself. She wasn't a social person. Where I remember her as her granddaughter was a very almost mean person. I mean, she went through so much. She had to be so strong. Her husband abandoned her and her 4 children in freezing Chicago. He disappeared. They couldn't find him. She tried to file for divorce. Jewish Family Services is the organization that basically saved her. They helped her pay for rent. They helped to give her, where to find food. Catholic food charities fed a lot of the immigrants that came to this country because they had the kitchens and they had the food, and that's where she got her food from. So it was Jewish Family Services and those support networks that basically supported my mother and her sisters in the family. But there were factions that looked down on these immigrants who can't even speak English, who come here and can't get a job. That went on. But what we saw was these factions they kept to themselves. Grandma kept to her small community. But that went on. And I certainly remember doing the research about looking down on these poor Eastern European Jews who are coming to this country with nothing. And that's, of course, then why we had this orphanage to take care of these kids, because their parents couldn't take care of them. But I'll add that the Jewish community in LA obviously did take care of these kids.
So in my conversations with especially Afghan immigrants who fled the violence in Afghanistan, and also people from other immigrant groups who fled violence, there's usually two patterns. One is people come to America, they see the American dream being realized, and they see their optimism justified, and then they continue to have that optimistic outlook. And the second trend I notice is that they see a sort of disillusionment with America and how America is versus how they imagined America to be, and they have a disillusionment that kind of sometimes makes them bitter the more years they spend in the country. What trend or mixture of trends would you say Regina's experience in America aligns with?
Well, we saw that with her second husband, who couldn't get a job in Chicago as a jeweler. You know, they thought, since he was a jeweler in Paris, that certainly he'd be able to get a job in the United States. And they chose Chicago because they were told it wasn't as crowded as New York, and there would be more opportunity in Chicago.
And, you know, I must add that it's very interesting that you share that, because a lot of immigrants who I've spoken to tended to have advanced degrees, advanced qualifications. One was a PhD student who did a PhD in Paris, but when it comes to the United States, or even if it's immigrants from other war-torn regions going to Western Europe, it's quite sad to see that their credentials for some reason are not recognized. So you have a lot of former Afghan government officials working as delivery drivers in Germany. So that's one parallel I noticed with your mention of, But
that's interesting. Yeah. Yes, I've seen some women who were physicians doing nails at a nail salon because they had to pay the rent and they couldn't get a job, or until English is good enough to take the test. But yeah, definitely have seen that as well. Thank you. You know, for Regina's second husband, you know, nobody wanted to hire him. He was the threat. He was competition. And he couldn't understand that, but they realized that after a while, and saw, you know, things that were going on, like in the playgrounds, where the kids would run through the playgrounds and they wouldn't hurt anybody, but they'd scream and yell and tell him, you know, get out of my country and go home. So they were a threat in some ways. You had these people coming from Eastern Europe who, as you said, were educated and skilled, but were looked down on or seen as competition. And there was more of that than we realized. And certainly in New York, we saw people, you know, selling, you know, apples on an apple cart just to make ends meet. And that was going on. I don't think people realized it in these earlier years, the kind of pushback that they had, even before the next wave of immigrants coming from, you know, World War II.
So towards her final years, was Regina happy about her decision to move to America? And I'm not speaking happy in the sense that she's grateful to be in America because it's more safer than Eastern Europe, but happy in the sense of her view of the quality of life. Or did she not really expect a very comfortable life when she came to America, and she just came primarily for safety? Could you just discuss a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, you know, for her, getting out of Poland was for her life. That, you know, as she was witnessing things going on, and then one of the members of the Jewish Labor Bund was attacked and died. It was fleeing for her life. I don't know that she specifically was looking at America as, the streets paved with gold. She was looking at America as a place to be safe. And for her, it wasn't about fancy life or big house. It was, I don't have to worry about being killed. My children are safe. So it was safety on her part. She was, and we were lucky, my mother and her sisters got good jobs. My aunts specifically married very well, and they took care of her. Because grandma really didn't have skills. I mean, her translation skills didn't work here because her English wasn't good enough. So whether she could translate Russian to Polish was fine, but what about to English? So her skills didn't matter. And like I said, she got a job at a bakery where she didn't have to have special skills. But it was the success, the personal success of her children that made her life okay. But my grandmother was never a fancy person. It wasn't about clothes and shoes and jewelry for her. It was, I have a meal, I have a roof over my head, and my daughters are safe and married and happy. She was materialistic in that she wanted to be sure she had a home and a safe place to live. So for her life was all about survival, not about, like I said, anything monetary. And like I said, she wouldn't talk about her family. When I was growing up, she said everybody died in the Holocaust. She never talked about the two surviving nephews that were my mother's first cousins. She kept it a secret. And we only learned about it after she died. And in her effects, there were letters from Joseph and Yana Anuszewicz with an address in Warsaw. And my mom found these and she said, who are these people? That's her maiden name, Anuszewicz, and that's the maiden name on these letters. She was writing to these nephews, but didn't tell us about it. And I think looking back at it now, knowing what she came from, I think she was keeping them safe, even in the 60s and the 70s. So she kept a lot close to her vest. It was what I learned about her from the surviving family that I found in Poland and in Paris. And anything that I knew as a child, knowing her life. So I think she, her escape from Poland made her very wary of those around her. I know that she didn't have a lot of friends, and she was very critical of a lot of people. And I think it was just how, what she did to leave the country and to be safe and not to share things with other people. So I think she carried that with her for the rest of her life.
Often in journalism and writing books, it's a rarity that we write about things that immediately concern us. But your book is something that concerned your own identity, your own worldview, and your own view of who you are, where you come from. How has uncovering and sharing Regina's story affected your understanding of your family's legacy and your conception of your own identity?
Yeah, this is the question that, people ask me about, Geri, you've known your grandmother your whole life. You've written other books. This isn't your first book. Why did you decide to write it now? And I think it's because of what's going on in the world today. What happened in Israel, the anti-Semitism we're seeing more in Europe and now in the United States. And I suddenly, turned back and looked at my grandmother and said, you've known this story. why are you telling it now? I think it's because of what's going on in the world now. And it's because I finally, really looking at Regina Anuszewicz and who she was and how that informs me. And looking at this amazing woman who, if I look at her as a distance and not as my grandma, and say, wow, look what she did. And look what other people did and other women. And I am her granddaughter. My mother and her sisters, very strong, obviously. Grandma raised her daughters to say, you can't depend on anyone else to take care of you. Dorothy, Josie, Rose, you have to take care of yourself. You can't depend on a man. You've got to have a skill. You've got to be able to earn your own living. And that's what she told them. And that's what my mother told me. Geri, you can't depend on anyone else to take care of you. You have to be able to take care of yourself. Even though my father, who was a sweetheart and a lovely man and provided a living, my mother and her sisters were very strong and very independent. Where'd they get it? They got it from their mother, who was not spoiled, who did not have a husband supporting her, who sent this message down. And so that defines me as a woman. And as somebody who says, you've got to be able to take care of yourself, Geri. And the other thing that my grandmother said, and my mother said to me, you better pay attention to politics. You better pay attention to what's going on in the world because it can change your life. And boy, don't we see that in this country as well. And so that defines my personality based on Regina and her life.
Lastly, to talk about anti-Semitism in the United States and Western countries, we have seen the amount of anti-Semitic incidents rise, as a result of which, particularly in Europe, many people are making aliyah to Israel. If you were to speak to the general American people, what would you say about the return of anti-Semitism on a large scale? If you were to give a warning, how would you put it out?
I think it's frightening what we're seeing now. I've been fortunate growing up in California. I lived in the East Coast. I was in Rhode Island for 5 years and Washington, D.C. for 6. And back in California, we're seeing it. And we've seen it mostly in a written form. But then there were two museum directors in New York whose homes were vandalized as a physical attack. I think it's very concerning. We used to say it could never happen here, but things are changing. And they're changing a lot in Europe, and especially in France. I no longer feel like, it can't happen here. People are taking mezuzahs off of their front doors because they don't want to be so easily identified as being Jewish. I never thought I would say these words, but I'm concerned, depending on the direction that this country is going. Would I pack up and go to Israel? I think it would. If it got worse, I'd probably start looking at something like that. I never thought I would say that. I never thought our country would be going in this kind of a direction. I always felt very comfortable and safe in identifying myself as a Jewish woman, a Jewish family, husband, children, grandchildren. So I'm concerned. And that's another reason I think I wanted to write the book now. Even 2 years ago, as I was deep into research, seeing things building and seeing what's going on in our electorate. And like you said, the normalization of racism, not just for Jews, but other races as well. We're seeing more of an acceptance on that level. And any racism is a risk for all races and religions. And so it's not okay for people to be racist against Muslims. That affects me too. It's not okay. And I think that's something we need to really pay attention to. And I hope that our country doesn't keep going in that direction because it's frightening. People find it easy to blame someone else for their misfortune.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just listened to Geri Spieler, author of the book Regina of Warsaw, Love, Loss, and Liberation. Geri Spieler, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Andrew Jose Show. If you have not already done so, please subscribe to us on Substack at andrewjoseshow.substack.com. We are also on Twitter and Instagram at Andrew Jose Show. Also, make sure to follow us on whatever podcast streaming platform you're using to listen to this podcast to not miss out on any new updates from this program. Thank you so much, and this is your host, Andrew Jose, signing off.